بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين وصلى الله على سيدنا ونبينا محمد وعلى أهل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. Assalamu alaikum, dear brothers and sisters, wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. I'd like to welcome you all to this new course that I'm offering. And in this course, we'll be covering one of the most important topics taught in the Hawza, which is Usul Al-Fiqh, not to be confused with Usul Al-Din. This is a course that looks at the principles of jurisprudence. Now, the book that we're going to be covering in these discussions is a book that was authored by Ayatullah Al-Uzma Sheikh Ja'far Al-Subhani, who was one of our contemporary maraji' in Qom, and it was requested of him to write a book on the topic of principles of jurisprudence for beginners. Now, I would say that this book is not entirely for beginners. I would say it's maybe closer to an intermediate level, especially for those who might not have a strong background in Usul Al-Fiqh. But according to the Hawza curriculum, this would definitely be considered an introductory text to the topic. So Al-Mujaz Fi Usul Al-Fiqh. Now the word Mujaz basically means a summary. Ijaz means to speak about something in a nutshell, to cover just some of the basic concepts. So from the title, it's very clear that this is an introductory course. It's a primer on the topic of Usul Al-Fiqh. Now, so as you can see here from the title, Al-Mujaz Fi Usul Al-Fiqh, Dawratun Usuliyya Mujaza, that this is an introductory course on Usul Al-Fiqh for who? للمبتدئين في هذا العلم. It's a primer, an introductory text for those who are beginning their study of this discipline. Ta'lif Ayatullah Al-Uzma Sheikh Ja'far Al-Subhani. And Sheikh Ja'far Al-Subhani is one of those unique scholars in our seminary who has authored books on a wide range of topics. He's written on the tafsir of the Quran. He's written on Islamic history. He has some great books on the biography of the Prophet. He's written on the history of the different sects within Islam. He's written on theology, on ethics. So he has made some significant contributions to the Islamic library in terms of the variety of the subjects that he's covered, as well as the depth. He's also written books on the topic of Ilm Al-Rijal, and some of his books are even taught as standard texts in the Hawza. Now, we'll begin with the first section. Now, of course, the introduction covers, so al-muqaddima wa fiha umur. So the book begins with an introduction, and the introduction covers 12 topics. So it's a fairly lengthy introduction, and inshallah we'll just dive right into the first section of the introduction. Al-amru al-awwal. So what I'll be doing in this course is that we're actually going to be going through this text line by line. For those of you who are not used to reading texts in the Arabic language, this is also going to be helpful in terms of practicing and getting accustomed to reading texts in the Arabic language. And I'll translate as I go, and I'll also provide some commentary and some clarifications in the English language as we go through this text. So, Al-Amru Al-Awwal, the first issue, the first topic in the introduction is Ta'arifu Ilm Al-Usul. We're going to be looking at the definition of علم الأصول وموضوعه وغايته. So we're looking at the definition of علم الأصول. We're looking at the subject matter of علم الأصول وغايته, and what is the objective? What is the purpose? Why are we even studying this topic? Now, he says, إن لفظة أصول الفقه تشتمل على كلمتين تدلان على أن هنا أصولا وقواعد يتكل الفقه عليها. He says that the term أصول الفقه is comprised of two words, and from these two words we understand that jurisprudence, that علم الفقه, relies upon certain rules. It relies upon certain principle. So usul al-fiqh essentially means the foundation, the principles upon which the science of jurisprudence relies and depends upon. فلا بد من تعريف الفقه أولا ثم تعريف أصوله ثانيا. In order for us to appreciate the meaning and the definition of usul al-fiqh, we have to break down these terms. We have to first understand what is the meaning of fiqh and what is the meaning of usul. Now, in terms of the definition of fiqh, he says, al-fiqhu ala ma huwa al-ma'ruf fi ta'rife. As for fiqh, as for jurisprudence, the common or the popularized definition is هو العلم بالأحكام الشرعية الفرعية عن أدلتها التفصيلية. So here, fiqh is basically the knowledge of the religious rulings. It is the knowledge of al-ahkam, the al-ahkam al-shar'iyya, religious rulings, but not any religious rulings. It is the knowledge, it's the discipline that deals with the religious rulings that pertain to the branches of the faith, far'iyya. And these religious rulings that relate to furu' ad-din, like salah, sawm, zakat, and so on, عن أدلتها التفصيلية. And these laws are derived not from the risala amaliya of your marja. No, a true faqih is that person who can derive the religious rulings that pertain to the branches of the faith from its detailed sources. And we'll explain what this means. So here in the next paragraph, Sheikh Al-Subhani breaks down this definition. He explains why certain words are being used as qualifiers and what they exclude in terms of their usage. فَخَرَجَ بِقَيْدِ الشَّرْعِيَّةِ الْعَقْلِيَّةِ. So when we go back to the definition, it says the definition of fiqh is هو العلم. It is that knowledge, it is that discipline. It is the knowledge of bil-ahkam, those rulings which are of a religious nature. Bil-ahkam al-shar'iyya. Now the word shar'iyya is an adjective. It qualifies the term ahkam. So it is a science that deals with religious rulings. And religious rulings means that we're not talking about intellectual and rational. We're not speaking about rational rulings. So the term shar'iyya excludes al-ahkam al-aqliyya, which is, discussed in philosophy and so on. So shar'iyya means that these are rulings that are religious. They're not of a rational nature. Okay? They're not like, philosophical principles and so on. وَبِالْ فَرْعِيَّةِ, and the reason why the word far'iyya is part of the definition is to exclude those religious rulings that are of a theological nature. وبالفرعية وبالفرعية الاعتقادية والمسائل الأصولية بالتفصيلية. So here he's saying هو العلم بالأحكام الشرعية. شرعية excludes rational rulings, rational principles. We're speaking specifically about rulings that are derived, that are religiously based. Al-Far'iyya excludes theological and issues that pertain to Usul Al-Din. وبالتفصيلية علم المقلد بالأحكام. Someone who is a faqih, who has mastered this discipline, knows, for example, the rulings of salah, because salah is one of furu' al-din. Now, you and I might know the ahkam of salah, but we don't know it from their detailed sources. We know it, for example, because we read the legal manual of the scholar that we follow. So, وَبِالتَّفْصِيلِيَّةِ عِلْمُ الْمُقَلِّدِ بِالْأَحْكَامِ. Now, most people, for example, know that the adhan is mustahab. It's not wajib to recite the adhan. Now, if I ask you, how do you know that hukum shar'i? How do you know that religious ruling that pertains to the adhan? Your answer will be what? That this is what Sayyid Sistani says. This is what Marji' A says or Marji' B says. So even though you have the knowledge of the ruling, your knowledge is not from adillatiha tafsili. It's not from the detailed sources. You're basically saying that it's mustahab because your marji' said so. Now, if I ask Sayyid Sistani, a faqih, if I ask him, why do you believe that the adhan is mustahab? He's not going to say that, well, because I read in the Risala Amaliyah of this specific scholar. He's going to be able to go to the sources. He's going to be able to go to the detailed sources, and he'll mention certain narrations, and he'll explain to you why this narration is reliable and why that narration is unreliable. So he can justify his position by going to the detailed sources. So even though both of us might know the conclusion, both of us might know that the adhan is mustahab, a faqih is someone who knows, whose knowledge is based on referring to the detailed sources, whereas the knowledge of the muqallid is basically what they read in the Risala Amaliyah. فَإِنَّهُ وَإِنْ كَانَ عَالِمًا بِالْأَحْكَامِ لَكِنَّهُ لَا عَنْ دَلِيلٍ تَفْصِيلٍ. When you and I know the ahkam of prayer or the ahkam of zakat, we don't know it based on its actual evidence, its detailed sources. بل بتبع دليل إجمالي وهو حجية رأي المجتهد في حقه في عامة الأحكام. We have a general idea, a general understanding of what the religious rulings are, and our knowledge of the ahkam are general, and they are based on what is a hujjah upon us, and that is that we follow the opinion of an expert in terms of our ahkam in general. وَأَمَّا الْمُجْتَهِدْ فَهُوَ عَالِمٌ بِكُلِّ حُكْمٍ عَنْ دَلِيلِهِ الْخَاصِ. As for the mujtahid, as for the jurist, their knowledge is based on specific evidence. It's not just following the opinion of a scholar like you and I. Each ruling in the Risala Amaliyah, in the legal manual of your marji', if you ask the marji', what is your evidence for this ruling? He will be able to produce his evidence and his juristic reasoning as to why he believes this particular issue is haram, or this is mustahab, or this is makruh, or this is wajib, and so on. So the knowledge of the mujtahid is based on his specific dalil. He has a specific evidence in that regard. So that is with respect to the meaning of fiqh. Someone who is a faqih is that person who has knowledge of the religious rulings that are far'iyya, that pertain to usul, that pertain to furu' ad-din, the religious practices, and those religious rulings that relate to the practices are derived from the detailed sources. Okay, that's the meaning of al-fiqh. Now, we are studying a science called Usul Al-Fiqh. Now, the question is, now that we've understood the meaning of fiqh, the technical meaning of fiqh, because fiqh also has a linguistic meaning that even predated Islam, and that is that the word fiqh, in its linguistic usage, means to have a deep understanding of something. At-tafaqquh fi ad-din means that you don't have just a superficial knowledge of something. You have an intricate, a deep, a nuanced understanding of a particular subject. So a faqih, so that's why it's related to the technical meaning. A faqih is that person who has a deep and nuanced understanding and knowledge of the religious rulings as they relate to the religious practices, furu' ad-din, from their detailed sources. Now, regarding the definition of usul, al-usul wa ilayka bayanu umurin thalatha fih. Now, when it comes to usul, there are three areas that we need to discuss. And he mentions, of course, what is the ta'rif, what is the definition of usul, what is the mawdu', what is the subject matter of usul, and what is the objective, what is the purpose of studying this discipline. تعريفه هو علم يبحث فيه عن القواعد التي يتوصل بها إلى استنباط الأحكام الشرعية عن الأدلة. Usul is basically, Usul Al-Fiqh is essentially the science or the discipline that examines and explores the qawa'id, the rulings and the principles, the rules and the principles التي يتوصل, that allow us to derive religious rulings from the sources, from the detailed sources. So هو علم يبحث فيه عن القواعد التي يتوصل بها إلى استنباط الأحكام الشرعية عن الأدلة. So Usul al-Fiqh is that science that essentially gives us the methodology. It gives us those general principles and those rules that allow us to achieve the goal of deriving religious rules, religious laws from the sources. وعلى ذلك فعلم أصول الفقه من مبادئ الفقه. And therefore, Usul al-Fiqh is essentially a prerequisite of fiqh. You know, there's a famous statement, you'll hear this often in the Hawza. They say, لا فقه من لا أصول له. A person cannot fully understand fiqh unless they have usul al-fiqh, unless they have a methodology. Because if you are studying fiqh and you don't have any principles upon which your derivation is built upon, then your istinbat is going to be all over the place. Your derivation of Islamic laws is going to be scattered and incoherent. So, la fiqh man la usul lah. If someone is weak in usul al-fiqh, they will never be a faqih. They will never be a proficient, a skilled jurist. So, Usul al-Fiqh, the principles of jurisprudence, are min mabadi' al-fiqh. They're one of the prerequisites. Just like learning the Arabic language is a prerequisite to understanding the Islamic laws, and it's a prerequisite for someone to be a scholar so they can go to the primary sources. Usul al-Fiqh is also a prerequisite. وَيَتَكَفَّلُ بيان كيفية إقامة الدليل على الحكم الشرعي. Usul al-Fiqh teaches you how to construct an argument, how to build evidence for your case when you want to argue that this is the specific ruling that I believe. So Usul al-Fiqh allows you to formulate an argument to basically establish religious rulings. Now, the next topic here is, so that's the definition of Usul al-Fiqh. Now, as for the mawdu', what is the subject matter? So, for example, almost all subjects and disciplines and sciences that we study, they have one main, and of course this is debated, but generally speaking, whenever you study any sort of discipline, there is usually one subject around which all of the issues and the issues of that discipline revolves. So, for example, biology. Biology is a science, it's a discipline. Now, what is the subject matter of biology? What are we studying? What is the subject? The subject is living things. It's the study of living things. So everything in biology essentially goes back to that fundamental subject matter, which is living things. Okay. Now, if you study, ilm al-nahu, if you study Arabic grammar or Arabic syntax, what's the subject? The subject is the Arabic word, al-kalima. With Usul al-Fiqh, the question here is, what is the subject? What do all of these matters and these issues and these details, everything that we're going to study, what is it revolving around? What is that unified subject matter, that single subject matter? موضوعه كل شيء يصلح لأن يكون حجة في الفقه ومن شأنه أن يقع في طريق الاستنباط. The subject matter of Usul al-Fiqh is anything that would constitute evidence in jurisprudence. ومن شأنه أن يقع في طريق الاستنباط. So basically, we're studying and we're trying to understand what constitutes a hujjah, what is considered admissible evidence in jurisprudence in our attempt to derive Islamic laws from the sources. So Usul al-Fiqh basically revolves around this single topic. The mawdu' is, what is a hujjah? What is considered evidence? What has probative force in jurisprudence in terms of deriving religious rulings from the sources? فإنه ليس كل قاعدة علمية تصلح لأن تكون حجة في الفقه. So we're not saying that any type of ruling, any type of rule or any type of principle is admissible as evidence in jurisprudence. فليس لمسائل العلوم الطبيعية ولا الرياضية هذه الصلاحية وإنما هي لعديد من المسائل. Now there are many general principles. You'll find general principles in the natural sciences. You'll find general rules and general principles in mathematics. But we're not speaking about those general principles. We're speaking about those general principles and those rules that aid us in deriving religious rulings from the sources. Like what? What are some of those general rulings? What are some of those general principles that help us in the process of istinbat? Istinbat means to derive, to draw, to extract religious rulings from the sources, from the Quran, from the Sunnah, from Ijma', and from Aql. And we'll speak about all of these issues. Now, among those principles is كظواهر الكتاب. If I come across ظواهر الكتاب means the apparent meaning of the verses of the Quran. Now we have so now I have to here just make a clarification regarding the difference between ظاهر and nas. There are some verses in the Quran that are nas, and nas means something that is clear cut. Nas is basically explicit. Nas, for example, is قُلْ هُوَ اللَّهُ أَحَدٌ. Say God, say He, God is one. This is an example of nas. Okay. There is no other possible explanation than the oneness of God. Okay. Now, there are other verses in the Quran that are not that clear cut, right? So when we say قُلْ هُوَ اللَّهُ أَحَدٌ, is there any possibility that it might mean that God is two? There is zero possibility. There is zero possibility. There is only one possible explanation, and there is a zero possibility that it has another meaning. This is nas. ظواهر al-kitab means that there's a verse, or there's a verse in the Quran that has an apparent meaning. Let's say that, and any rational person will go along with that apparent meaning. Let's say that there's a 90% chance that the apparent meaning is what is intended. Now, there might be a 10% chance that it has another meaning, that instead of the literal meaning, it might have, a metaphorical meaning, as an example. Now, ظواهر al-kitab, unless we have evidence that it has another meaning, the default is that we go with the apparent meaning. Now, the question is, the apparent meaning, let's say that we don't have any external clue to go away from the apparent meaning of the verse. Can we use the apparent meaning of an ayah as evidence, as a hujjah? This is one of the discussions that we'll go into more depth. So among the general principles is ظواهر al-kitab hujjah? Are the apparent meanings evidence? Are they considered hujjah? Or is it only nas? Is it only those explicit verses that have no possible, there's no possible explanation other than them? Are those the only verses that are hujjah? Is it only nas, or can we also go with ظواهر al-kitab, the apparent meaning of the verses? وَخَبَرُ الْوَاحِدِ, if we have, for example, a narration, and let's say that it's not mutawatir, it's not hyper corroborated. Let's say that we have a hadith from Imam al-Sadiq and it's only from one individual. Do we need to have multiple ahadith for us to use the content of that hadith as a hujjah, as evidence? So for example, let's say we only have one hadith that indicates that adhan is mustahab. I don't have 10, 15 narrations where I can say it's mutawatir and tawatur. Because it's hyper corroborated, it gives me certainty. One narration just gives me a dhan. It gives me, a higher level, it gives me a certain degree of probability that's below certainty. Can I act upon khabar al-wahid? Is khabar al-wahid is a solitary report? Is that considered hujjah in establishing that a particular that this particular religious ruling is wajib or mustahab or makruh and so on? Is khabar al-wahid hujjah? So these are just some examples of the general principles that help us in determining what is a hujjah. وَالشُّهْرَ الْفَتْوَائِيَّةِ, imagine there is a verdict, a very popular verdict among the jurists. If, many of the qudama, many of the ancient scholars, they had a specific ruling, and this was a fatwa that was popular among the jurists. Can I use the popularity of a fatwa of our ulama as evidence to support, to support my view regarding whether something is wajib, haram, makruh, mustahab, and so on? إلى غير ذلك, and so on. So when we speak about al-qawaid, when we speak about those general principles that help us in deriving Islamic laws, these are some examples of them. The apparent meaning of the Quran hujjah? Is khabar al-wahid, is a non-mutawatir report, a solitary report, for example, is it considered hujjah? Can I base a religious ruling on a single report, on a solitary non-mutawatir report? Can I base a religious ruling on its popularity among other fuqaha? Are these hujjah? These are all discussions that we're going to have in Usul Al-Fiqh to determine what is the evidentiary threshold for something to be used as evidence in Islamic jurisprudence. غايته. Now, what is the purpose? What is the objective? What is the aim of studying principles of jurisprudence? What's the aim? What is the ghaya of studying Usul Al-Fiqh? I think it's quite obvious by now. The objective of studying Usul Al-Fiqh is القدرة على استنباط الأحكام الشرعية عن أدلتها. The purpose of studying this discipline is to develop the ability to derive religious rulings from their sources. You know, if someone wants to be, you don't want to just be a person. You're studying this because, I mean, if you intend on going to the hawza and pursuing ijtihad, the ultimate goal is to do what? It's to have the ability to derive the religious rulings from the sources, not just from the risala amaliya of your marja. Of course, for most people, because they never reach the level of ijtihad, they have to just rely on the expert opinion of the jurist. You know, when people ask me, Sheikh, do we have to do taqleed? I always tell them, no, you don't have to do taqleed. You can also be a faqih yourself. You can be a mujtahid. But if you're not going to be a subject expert, then you have to rely on the experts. So the purpose, the objective of Usul Al-Fiqh is to develop the ability to derive al-ahkam al-shar'iyya, the religious rulings, from the sources. You actually go to the Quran, you actually go to our hadith corpus, and you examine the narrations, and you implement those general principles, and then you come to conclusions. القدرة على استنباط الأحكام الشرعية عن أدلتها والعثور على أمور يحتج بها في الفقه. Usul al-Fiqh gives you the ability to, come across, you're able to come across things that you can use as evidence in Islamic jurisprudence to establish that this is a hukum shar'i, right? والعثور على أمور يحتج بها في الفقه على الأحكام الشرعية. If someone asks you, is the adhan mustahab? Someone who has studied usul al-fiqh, someone who is a faqih, someone who's a mujtahid, they're going to go to the sources. They're going to actually go to the ahadith, and they're going to look at all of the ahadith, and if there are conflicting narrations, they're going to be able to resolve and reconcile if it's possible. They're going to be looking at chains of transmission, and they're going to be applying all of these general principles as they derive the religious rulings from the sources. ومما ذكرنا يعلم وجه الحاجة إلى أصول الفقه. Now, with this, with what we've covered so far, it's very obvious why it is important to learn, and why this discipline is needed in fiqh. فإن الحاجة إليه كالحاجة إلى علم المنطق. The relationship, the reason why we need usul al-fiqh is the same reason why we need mantiq. It's the reason why we need mantiq. Logic teaches us how to formulate a syllogism. It teaches us how to think rationally, how to have, a minor premise, a major premise, and a conclusion that is rational, that is coherent. فكما أن المنطق يرسم النهج الصحيح في كيفية إقامة البرهان. So just as logic teaches us how to construct a coherent argument, that you can construct a burhan, فهكذا الحال في علم الأصول. And the same applies to the principles of jurisprudence, Usul Al-Fiqh. فإنه يبين كيفية إقامة الدليل على الحكم الشرعي. Usul Al-Fiqh does the same. It teaches you how to construct an argument to establish a religious ruling, whether that religious ruling is wajib, mustahab, makruh, mubah, haram. It basically teaches you how to formulate the argument to make your case. Now, the second section, we'll cover the second section and we'll conclude. Al-Amr al-Thani. So again, we're looking at 12 discussions, and this is all part of the introduction. Al-Amr al-Thani, taqsimu mabahithi. Taqsimu mabahithi means that, a categorization of the different topics that we cover in Usul Al-Fiqh. تنقسم المباحث الأصولية إلى أربعة أنواع. There are four different discussions that we cover in Usul Al-Fiqh. الأول المباحث اللفظية. The first discussion is linguistic discussions. Lafz basically means a verbal utterance. Al-mabahith, of course, this is the plural of mabhath. Al-mabahith, the linguistic discussions. وَيَقَعُ الْبَحْثُ فِيهَا عَنْ مَدَالِيلِ الْأَلْفَاظِ. Now, what we study in linguistic discussions, we study the indications of verbal utterances. وَظَوَاهِرِهَا, and we look at the apparent meanings of certain verbal utterances. التي تقع في طريق الاستنباط. Now, when we study Usul Al-Fiqh, we're not studying the indications and the apparent meanings of all words. We're looking specifically and studying those concepts relating to the indication of words and the apparent meaning of words that fall on the path of deriving religious rulings. And he gives an example. نظير ظهور صيغة الأمر في الوجوب. An example of a linguistic discussion is صيغة الأمر. صيغة الأمر basically is a commanding verb. Does a commanding verb indicate obligation? So if the Quran says أقم الصلاة, establish, أقم is a verb, it's a commanding verb. صيغة الأمر أقم الصلاة. Now when the Quran says establish the prayer, this word establish, that's a commanding verb, that's صيغة الأمر. Does that indicate obligation, that prayer is obligatory? If you say yes, well, we have ahadith, for example, where our imams alayhimus salam, they also use صيغة الأمر, and they say, for example, اغتسل للجمعة, perform the Friday prayer ghusl. Now, are you also arguing that ghusl al-jum'ah is wajib? So this is a discussion. Does صيغة الأمر, does the form of a commanding verb, does it indicate obligation or not? This is something that we discuss. الثاني, the second discussion that we cover in Usul Al-Fiqh is المباحث العقلية. And these are intellectual or rational discussions. ويقع البحث فيها عن الأحكام العقلية الكلية. Now we look at these general rational principles that relate to, that fall on the path of deriving Islamic laws, right? ويقع البحث فيها عن الأحكام العقلية الكلية, these universal rational principles التي تقع في طريق الاستنباط, that fall on the path that we have to encounter as we derive religious rulings. An example, نظير البحث عن وجود الملازمة بين وجوب الشيء ووجوب مقدمته. Looking, for example, at the relationship between an obligation and the obligation of its prerequisites. So, for example, if Hajj becomes wajib, let's say that someone is mustati', someone is able-bodied, and they have the financial resources, and they fulfill all of the conditions whereby Hajj becomes wajib upon them. Okay, Hajj is wajib upon you. Does that mean that all of the prerequisites, all of the preliminaries that allow you to perform Hajj also become wajib? So does that mean that getting a passport becomes wajib? Let's say you don't have a passport. Is it wajib upon you to get a passport? Is it wajib upon you to buy an airline ticket? Is it wajib upon you to get vaccinated, and so on and so forth? So what is the relationship between the obligation of a thing and the obligation of its preliminaries? This is a very detailed, lengthy discussion that we cover in Usul Al-Fiqh. الثالث مباحث الحجج والأمارات. This is a discussion relating to what constitutes a hujjah, what constitutes evidence in fiqh, and al-amarat. Al-amarat are those things that are basically treated, they are basically given the weight of, they don't give us full confidence, but they're dhanni in nature. And we'll speak about what that means. Amarat, meaning that they don't fully uncover reality, but they give us a certain level of comfort in terms of the accuracy. كالبحث عن حجية خبر الواحد. Among the discussions that we look at is the hujjiyah, the evidence or the probative force of a solitary خبر الواحد, a solitary report. You know, the report of a single person, or a report that is less than mutawatir. Is that considered hujjah or not? So what constitutes evidence is essentially what مباحث الحجج والأمارات is. الرابع مباحث الأصول العملية. The fourth discussion in Usul Al-Fiqh is a discussion relating to procedural principles or practical principles. وهي تبحث عن مرجع المجتهد عند فقد الدليل على الحكم الشرعي. What does a jurist do if they don't have any evidence? Meaning an issue comes up. For example, someone asks a scholar, is smoking haram? There's no ayah in the Quran that prohibits smoking. There is no ahadith that prohibits smoking. So we don't have any dalil shar'i from our sources. What does a mujtahid do if they are not able to find an explicit or even implicit, if they're not able to find an explicit evidence in the sources? They don't have any evidence. What do? At the end of the day, people have to act. They have to conduct themselves in a certain way. Do they abstain? Are they allowed? What do you do when you simply don't have any evidence for something? There are certain procedural principles that allow a person to identify what their responsibility is before Allah in such a situation. So when a mujtahid doesn't have any evidence in terms of establishing a religious ruling, there are certain procedural principles that they turn to, and this is what we study in Usul Al-Fiqh. ويمكن تقسيمها بملاك آخر وهو تقسيمها إلى مباحث لفظية. There's another way of categorizing the discussions in Usul Al-Fiqh, and that is you can categorize it into linguistic discussions and rational discussions. وهذا هو الرائج بين المتأخرين. And this is, the trend among some of the later scholars. So, for example, there are some scholars who've written on the topic of usul. They'll cover all of the linguistic discussions, and then they will transition to the rational and intellectual discussions at the end of the book. وَرَتَّبْنَا كِتَابَنَا على ترتيب مباحث الكفاية. Sheikh Al-Subhani, he says, the book that is before you, I have organized it based on the order and the sequence of the discussions in Al-Kifaya, which is the famous book that was written by Al-Akhund Al-Khurasani, which, in the Hawza, we refer to it as Quran Al-Usul. It's like the Quran of Usul Al-Fiqh. If you don't, it's the focal point of discussions in Bahth Al-Kharij, especially in the topic of Usul. Al-Amr Thalith Al-Wadh. This relates to the phenomenon and the relationship between words and meanings, and how words are coined, and how words are assigned to meanings. Inshallah, we'll cover that in our next lesson. وآخر دعوانا أن الحمد لله رب العالمين وصلى الله على سيدنا ونبينا محمد وعلى أهل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين.